Thank you, Derval. Yes, I began to realise I am the token man, for which I thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. Minister, Madam Chair, Stewart or Bunahor, whatever I call you, and my good friends from Glenties. It's lovely to be back. I was for many years a very frequent visitor to Glenties, and then life took over and I just got back into the swing of it, I suppose, a couple of years back. And it's always a great pleasure to be here, a lovely part of the country, and lovely to meet so many of my old friends. This time last year, my beloved wife Anne was here with me. She passed away since, and it's just been wonderful. She's a Donegal woman from roots in the Rosses, and it's just been nice to have had so many warm compliments and so many warm wishes for her and so many warm inquiries for myself. So it's nice to be here and feel myself among friends, and if I may say so, among family. Now, that's the nice bit. This time last year, as Derval has said, those of us who were here at the Patrick MacGill Summer School will remember there was an enormous focus on policing and on reform and on possible future models for the Garda Síochána, and the then neophyte Minister Frances Fitzgerald was with us and was very open and very frank with us and contributed enormously to our deliberations. She had just recently been appointed to the Justice portfolio, and she was very frank and very open about the challenges facing her in her new role, and that added greatly, as I say, to the wisdom of our deliberations last year. The then acting Commissioner, Noreen O'Sullivan, was also with us. Of course, she was since appointed to the role of Commissioner, and she was also very forthright and very open with us in sharing her ambitious vision for the future of Irish policing. Providing good policing is the state's primary duty, I would argue, after the physical defence of the territory of the state. The preservation of life and property, peace and order, and the providing a climate in which people can go about their business in safety is one of the state's primary duties to its citizens. The necessity of providing an effective and accountable police service was recognised even before the state came into being, and in this decade of anniversaries, it's just worth remembering that the planning for the new civic guard, such a priority was given to it by Collins and Griffith and the other members of the provisional government. The planning actually started quite some time before the state was actually established, in that the state was established in December 1922, and they began planning for the Guards the previous March. Policing in the community is important to everybody, but it's particularly important to the vulnerable, the isolated and the weak. When it operates effectively and accountably, it enriches all of our lives, but when it goes wrong or when it is non-effective, it can make ordinary persons' lives intolerable. The mood this time last year, as I recall it here in this hall, was a mixture of bemusement, distress and concern on one hand, and on the other, hope that with a new minister in the Department of Justice, a new commissioner due to be appointed, and with promises of far-reaching reform, that we were actually on the way to shaping a police force that would be efficient, free from improper manipulation, and fully in tune with the needs of the community. In the preceding months, we had had an extraordinary sequence of events within the state's justice and policing structure. Derval has rehearsed the highlights of that sequence, but it's worth actually going through them in detail and in sequence. We had first the reported surveillance or bugging of the headquarters of the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission. We had the disturbing and the sustained allegations by the whistleblowers within the Garda Síochána of systemic neglect of duty and abuse of privilege. We had the revelations of the taping of telephone traffic in and out of Garda stations. We had the resignation in unexplained circumstances yet of the Garda Commissioner Martin Callanan, the resignation of the Minister for Justice Alan Shatter, the departure of the confidential recipient Oliver Connolly, the departure of Simon O'Brien as the chair of GSOC, and the reassignment of the Secretary General of the Department of Justice, Brian Purcell. So just a few short years after the passing into law of what the then Justice Minister Michael MacDowell had described as the most far-reaching police reform since the foundation of the state, it seemed that we were suddenly back to a place that we thought we had left behind after the Morris Tribunal reports into the policing abuses that had been allowed to flourish here in parts of County Donegal and the division of Donegal. It is fair to say, as far as we can judge, that the allegations which have been levelled and which have been significantly substantiated, the allegations of Sergeant Maurice McCabe and former Garda John Wilson, are probably not as serious as some of the alleged scandals that took place here in Donegal. But what has surely been disturbing, in spite of the supposed checks and balances and safeguards put in place in the 2005 Act, and in spite of all of the promises from the Garda Síochána itself, is that systemic abuse of authority and serious neglect could occur so soon again, and that those within the force who tried to send up alarm signals were sidelined by authority and, in some cases, victimised by colleagues. Rather quickly, a big credibility gap opened up around the operation of the Garda Síochána, and it wasn't handled well either by the Garda authorities or by those holding political responsibility. It is something of a cliché to speak of the Garda Síochána of an institution that circles the wagons when it comes under scrutiny. But just because something is a cliché doesn't mean it isn't true. The Garda Síochána is an organisation with many virtues. It does wonderful work, and it has a great many fine men and women among its membership. But dealing with scrutiny is not among its best developed skill sets. It is extraordinarily defensive, and it brings denial to an art form. Sadly, in my experience, many of even the best Gardaí, not all of them, but many, will frequently turn a blind eye to the bad behaviour of the worst of their colleagues. Perhaps in that they're not so different from any other vocational groups. We've seen that in the medical profession, we've seen it in religion, we've seen it in the legal profession for a time, we see it in accountancy. But it is nonetheless a significant element of Garda culture. In this denial and in this cover, I have to say, they're almost always supported by the political establishment. And it doesn't really matter who is in power. There is an unwritten rule that the government of the day will and must protect the Guards from criticism, yielding to public disquiet only when problems become so glaringly evident that it is politically impossible to ignore them. And thus we have inquiries. We've had the Guerin inquiry into the alleged bugging of GSOC. We have the Fennelly inquiry continuing into the alleged taping of phone calls in Garda stations and the events surrounding the departure of Commissioner Callanan. We have the O'Higgins inquiry examining the allegations of Sergeant McCabe. And we have an inquiry by Supreme Court Judge Frank Clark into GSOC's role in the events surrounding the tragic death of Sergeant Michael Galvin in Ballyshannon here in Donegal. Simultaneously, in credit to the Minister and the Government, we've had a series of executive and legislative initiatives aimed at addressing the more serious issues that have arisen. Taoiseach Enda Kenny and then Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore agreed that there would be a new independent policing authority. The Minister, Francis Fitzgerald, announced that henceforth the commissionership of the Garda Síochána would be filled by open competition and that candidates outside the force might apply. She announced that she would strengthen the powers of GSOC. The oversight body would have authority to investigate complaints against the Garda Commissioner, bringing it thereby into line with the powers available to its counterpart bodies in Northern Ireland and in Britain. It would also be empowered to receive and to investigate complaints from serving Gardaí, which was explicitly prohibited by the provisions of the 2005 Act. It would be enabled to undertake inquiries into any practice, policy or procedure of the Garda Síochána without having to secure the prior consent of the Minister, as had been required in the 2005 Act. It would be given the same powers as the Garda Síochána and indeed the revenue and the defence forces to gather evidence for use in court using covert electronic technologies, although to the best of my knowledge, GSOC has neither the technology nor the trained personnel to do this just at this time. So for a time it sounded as if the measures to be introduced by the new minister would bridge the gaps or remedy the flaws in the 2005 legislation, flaws that enabled the Gardaí, frankly, to treat GSOC with contempt. There has been some progress and there will be more. We have had a Garda Commissioner, Noreen O'Sullivan, the first ever to be appointed in open competition and indeed the first woman to occupy the role. We have a chair for the new policing authority in the person of Josephine Feely, the respected former chair of the Revenue Commissioners. We have a new chair for GSOC, Miss Justice Mary Ellen Ring. And we have the shape of the legislation with which the Minister proposes to address the flaws that have emerged in the 2005 Act. But I fear that much of what has emerged in the proposed legislation falls a distance short of what was being indicated this time last year, and also some distance short of what I believe to be necessary. The Garda Ombudsman's capacity to investigate complaints against the Commissioner is to be restricted to certain types of complaint. Anything to do with security will be off limits. And in order to investigate complaints against the Commissioner, GSOC will need the consent of the Minister. And it turns out that the Independent Policing Authority is not going to be quite so independent after all. In contrast with the Northern Ireland Policing Board, for example, it will not have the authority either to appoint or to remove the Commissioner, although it may nominate persons to the post. The power of appointment and removal will remain with the politicians. Nor will it have any authority to look into anything to do with security. That will remain the preserve of government. Yes, the Commissioner will be answerable to the authority for civil policing, but who will decide what pertains to security and what pertains to civil policing? The answer is the Minister. Now, I have no difficulties about that while Francis Fitzgerald is Minister for Justice. But I can think of several people in the past who have held the justice portfolio to whom I would not happily entrust that adjudication. And I can think of some people ambitious of power in the future who, in a position of control in the Department of Justice, I would not entrust with the power to take that decision either. It is important to understand that our policing system is unique in Europe in that the Garda Síochána combines both the functions of a civil police force and the state's primary security service. So our local chief superintendent, our superintendent, is not just the chief of police for the county or the district. He or she is also the local head of the state's security organisation. And where a conflict of resources or priorities arises, experience shows us that he or she will always be required to put state security first and the policing requirements of the community second. And because state security can always be put beyond independent scrutiny, Gardaí at any time, human nature being what it is, will invoke state security as a reason to bring down the shutters or the blinds. The problems here in Donegal, and virtually all of the problems down the years in the Garda Síochána, have invariably been shielded by the invocation of the immunities and the prerogatives of state security. It has been abused, it has invariably been the case, and it will happen in the future unless appropriate safeguards and checks are put in place. I don't pretend that there are no difficult issues here. This state has had to cope with violent and organised subversion that would have significantly if not completely, undermined our democracy and replaced it with fascist repression. And of course, the state and the government must have control over its security services. But there have to be restraints and checks to ensure some independent accountability, even in the security realm, and regrettably, we have none of these, nor are any envisaged. Any aspect of policing, therefore, can be put beyond independent examination or review by the simple diktat of whoever happens to be Minister for Justice. Once the Garda authorities put on the cloak of state security, they are beyond the scrutiny of and freed from any accountability to anyone beyond the civil servants in the Department of Justice and the Minister. This is in contrast to other jurisdictions. It's not like that everywhere. For example, in the United Kingdom, the heads of MI5 and MI6, the British Security Services, appear regularly before Westminster's Security and Intelligence Committee. They're questioned about their performance, their effectiveness and their decision-making. But there is not a single instance in the history of this state in which any senior security functionary, whether civil or military, has been asked to give a public account of their stewardship. There is a clear need here, I would suggest, for some form of judicial determination as to what pertains to ordinary policing as distinct from security. It is wrong, I suggest, that this should be left solely to a minister, and it has been grievously abused in the past. It will always be tempting for ministers for justice to place matters that may be politically inconvenient or embarrassing behind the protective screen of security, and it will always be tempting for the Gardaí to seek to do the same thing. I do not, I repeat, underestimate the difficulties facing government in trying to build confidence in the Garda Síochána as a police force that is operationally independent, while requiring it at the same time to discharge essential functions on behalf of the state. But there has always been a problem of doublethink and doublespeak for the political establishment on this issue. Structures and procedures are put up that for a time may give the impression that this operational independence of the police is safeguarded. Similarly, bodies like the Ombudsman, the Garda Inspectorate and the Policing Authority are brought into being with the aim, supposedly, of ensuring independence. But at every step of the way, it seems to me, these initiatives are qualified by provisions that make exceptions and bring authority back to central government. There is always a clause that brings the final say-so and the final decision back to the Minister, the Department of Justice, or the leadership of the Gardaí themselves. Some will say that is a perfectly valid model of government. Michael MacDowell, I know, believes very strongly that any deviation or dilution of that model is constitutionally unacceptable. The point I would make is that what we are being told we're getting is quite different, whereas in actual fact we're getting the retention of centralised control. Some of these oversight bodies are given names that sound remarkably like police oversight bodies in Northern Ireland and Great Britain, that actually are independent and that do actually have powers to regulate police standards and behaviour, but they are not the same. The PSNI, or the police forces of England and Wales, have to take their local police boards or commissioners, have to take Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and they have to take the Independent Police Complaints Commission a great deal more seriously than the Garda Síochána have to take the Garda Inspectorate, the Ombudsman Commission, or, I venture to say, the forthcoming police authority. We have a policing model which is much closer to that of the European gendarmerie than the British constabulary. Our police force is designed to prioritise the needs of central government rather than those of local communities. And the fact that the Gardaí remain so well integrated with the community is testimony, I would argue, to the personal qualities of so many of the men and women who serve in the force, rather than to the design of the organisation. I doubt if the political and civil service establishment will ever allow us to get beyond the appearances of independent oversight, operational independence, or genuine accountability, up to the most senior ranks or in the most sensitive areas. The sort of problems we have witnessed recently and at depressingly regular intervals in the past will regrettably, I believe, repeat themselves in the future. Thank you.